C'est vraiment mon plaisir de vous accueillir à cette discussion virtuelle aujourd'hui sur la politique étrangère canadienne avec l'Honourable Erin O'Toole. Il est député fédéral pour le comté ontarien de Durham et bien sûr chef du Parti conservateur du Canada. Je m'appelle Nicolas Moyer et je suis directeur général de Coopération Canada. C'est l'association nationale des plus de 2000 organisations humanitaires et de coopération internationale au Canada qui ensemble travaillent pour avancer les droits de la personne et travaillent pour un monde meilleur. In a virtual event, I'm joining you from Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Algonquin, and Huron-Wendat peoples. Wherever you may be, I hope you're familiar with the First Nations on whose ancestral lands you live. The long hand of our colonial history defines our present and the privileges we enjoy today as individuals and as a G7 country, ranked as we are among the best off by a great many measures. It's a history with great international relevance and influence and worth keeping front of mind as we turn our discussion today to Canada's place in the world. Today's town hall on foreign policy with the Honourable Erin O'Toole is brought to you in partnership by 6 partner organizations: the Business Council of Canada, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian International Council, the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, Cooperation Canada, and Global Canada. These leading associations follow Canada's foreign policy very closely, each with their own priorities on trade, development, and diplomacy. The sectors we represent are vectors of Canada's international relations, and our respective members know the strategic importance of Canada's global engagement. Nous savons tous que l'avenir du Canada est profondément lié aux enjeux qui transcendent les frontières: économie et commerce, changement climatique et sécurité, droits de la personne et démocratie, pour n'en citer que quelques-uns, alors même que nous luttons tous contre une urgence de santé publique mondiale avec des profondes conséquences à l'étranger et dans notre propre pays. Comme l'attestent les décennies depuis la Seconde Guerre mondiale, le Canada réussit en partageant le progrès qui a lieu dans le monde entier. Comme il l'a fait à maintes reprises au cours de son histoire, notre pays a également un rôle à jouer pour façonner l'avenir du progrès mondial à l'image de ses principes. As a man who aspires to lead our country, Mr. O'Toole's views hold much sway, and we're here to learn more about his priorities for Canada's foreign policy. Participants today had a chance to register their questions for Mr. O'Toole and to share their top foreign policy priorities. This information has been shared in advance with Mr. O'Toole, and we certainly hope to get to many of the issues you shared with us this hour. Following Mr. O'Toole's opening remarks, we'll hear questions in turn from representatives of each of the partners in organizing today's event, prepared in part based on priorities shared by their stakeholders. And time permitting, we look forward at the end to get to some questions from the audience. That's all you'll get from me by way of introduction, and it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Erin O'Toole with us today. Mr. O'Toole, over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Moyer. It's good to be with you. While I wish we could have done this in person, and I've done events with some of your partners in the past in person and have enjoyed it, I'm glad we can do it virtually, and I'm glad to see a few friends and familiar faces on this call. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the presence of my colleagues, part of our Conservative team, the Honourable Michael Chong, the Conservative Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Garnet Jennis, the Shadow Minister for International Development, and the Honourable Mike Lake, who's got a decade of experience on many of the issues we'll be talking about today from a development standpoint. These Conservative members of Parliament are driving our compassionate, interest-driven approach to development and foreign affairs. We've been working hard on preparing our vision for the sector, and I'm proud to detail some of it with you today. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous parler de la vision du Parti conservateur pour le développement international. Je suis fier d'être le chef du parti qui co-créé la francophonie, qui a combattu l'apartheid et qui a défendu la liberté religieuse à travers le monde. Mais surtout, je suis fier de venir d'une petite communauté qui a accueilli des réfugiés vietnamiens dans les années 70 et qui continue d'accueillir des familles syriennes aujourd'hui. Pour moi, le développement et nos intérêts nationaux ne sont pas opposés. Ces deux priorités vont ensemble et je veux vous en parler. But before we do that, I want to turn the spotlight to you on this call. There's no hiding it. I know that this has been a tough year for your organizations. You know that all too well. Few sectors have been as impacted as some of our NGO and civil society sectors. And so I'm all the more impressed by the way in which Cooperation Canada and all of your members and partners were able to adjust to the pandemic. Through the lows of the past year, you've continued your important work for Canadians at home and abroad. Despite the challenges, Canada can be proud of its history in international development and foreign policy. From government-led initiatives under CETA in the 1970s to the strong network of NGOs leading the charge today, we have much to celebrate. To see innovative partnerships between nonprofits, the Canadian Chamber, the Business Council, and other players is proof of your ingenuity. If this year has shown us one thing, it's the importance of solidarity, it's the importance and resilience of building partnerships. Your work helps cement Canada's place in the world, and I want to thank all of you as we start this session today. As someone who served in our Canadian Armed Forces, I also think a lot about Canada's role in the world. A strong military is critical for how we project our values and support our interests and allies around the world. But so too is a principled development policy. Our country's commitment to international development is first and foremost an expression of our compassion. We contribute to development out of a sincere belief in human dignity and in the rights of all to live free from hunger and poverty. But we can no longer remain naive about what is going on around us. It is our responsibility to also recognize how some powers, like the Chinese Communist Party, are weaponizing aid to extend their sphere of influence. I'm not talking about moving pawns on a global chessboard. I'm talking about a planned and meticulous assault on democracy in many parts of the world. Just look at Myanmar and the destabilizing role the Communist Party of China plays in that conflict. Now, you and I know that now is not the time to disengage from international development. First on the humanitarian front, but also in our fight for democracy. We cannot leave the field wide open for bad actors who have none of the sincere compassion and values we do. But to be frank, in my view, our current Liberal government is falling short. They talk a very good game on international development, but as a share of gross national income, the Liberals have made a 10% cut to foreign aid from the levels from the last Conservative government. It will come as no surprise to you if I say that on aid, the Liberal government of Mr. Trudeau overpromises and consistently underdelivers. They are very good at the photo ops, but far less so at the follow-throughs. And while organizations in Canada have had a hard time maintaining their operations, the Liberals sometimes deliver aid through mechanisms that are actually hostile to our interests and values. The Chinese-controlled Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank shouldn't be part of Canada's global reach. It should be organizations like Coopération Canada's members and other important partners to make our country proud when we do development abroad. La montée de la Chine pose un grand défi pour toutes les démocraties. Mais on ne peut pas laisser un pays autoritaire nous intimider. Il faut travailler avec nos alliés pour faire la promotion de libre-échange entre peuples libres. Le commerce équitable doit jouer un rôle dans notre politique de développement. Je vais travailler avec la francophonie, le Commonwealth, le G7 et ses alliés très proches comme Kanzak pour faire la promotion du commerce qui respecte nos valeurs. Plus ces pays savent que développement et démocratie peuvent aller ensemble, moins ils vont vouloir se plier à la Russie et à la Chine. Je suis heureux de voir la collaboration entre nos chambres de commerce et Coopération Canada. Il faut plus d'innovation comme ça. Mais pour le faire, il faut des ONG qui peuvent compter sur un financement stable. I've heard from many of you that small and medium-sized organizations are seeing their funding dry up in favor of large, impersonal multilateral organizations. This shift shows a government that prioritizes accolades from bureaucrats on the foreign stage over agile Canadian NGOs. That is not the approach we will take. We have some of the best talent in the world here. When Canada provides aid, it should be led by organizations that have a maple leaf on their heart or on their shoulder. But maintaining a vibrant development sector also requires predictable and accessible funding. I'm proud of the tens of thousands of Canadians who give of their own time and their own support to support development causes. NGOs must be able to access these funds more effectively. A Conservative government will reform the onerous direction and control requirements imposed by Canada Revenue. Our advocacy on the Foreign Affairs Committee has already led to a unanimous recommendation calling on the government to fix this issue. Leadership isn't just in the big ideas, it's also in ensuring we can operationalize them. In this way, my government will have your back. As we look to a volatile decade ahead, we must remember that Canada remains a beacon of hope and freedom for millions abroad. This country has welcomed countless refugees fleeing war and persecution, and it stands as a guardian of human dignity abroad. Poor human development today is often the result of political breakdown, war, and injustice. Ending poverty must go hand in hand with ending conflicts and delivering justice to victims. Canada and our allies have an important role to play. We must reform United Nations peacekeeping, demand more accountability, provide stable troop commitments, and infuse peacekeeping with Canadian development and capacity building expertise. A Conservative government will make the advancement of peace, justice, and human rights a central tenet of our foreign policy. And this focus will include bringing back the Office of Religious Freedom. At a time when the Chinese Communist Party is carrying out a horrific genocide against Uyghur Muslims, at a time when Christians across the Middle East are persecuted for their faith, and at a time when anti-Semitism is once more on the rise globally, we simply cannot stay silent. Religious freedom is a human right, and a Conservative government will act accordingly. Before wrapping up, I want to say a few words about COVAX. As a result of the Trudeau government's failures on vaccine plans, Canada is the only G7 country to be drawing from COVAX. The government tells us that everything is fine, and this was what they had planned all along. But let's be honest, this is sad and disappointing. It's the result of poor planning by Prime Minister Trudeau. Canadians wish their government had planned to be ahead of the game, supplying Canadians with vaccinations early, capacity, supply early, and then contributing to other countries from our ability to gain early access. Instead of that, we must now draw for our own needs from the world's most vulnerable supply. Canada's failure on vaccines is hurting Canadians, but it's also hurting our international reputation. Friends, the coming year will be fraught with challenges. Rebuilding from the pandemic, finding solutions to international health concerns, strengthening our alliances, and standing up against rising authoritarianism. These challenges cannot be tackled by the federal government alone. It requires us to work hand in hand to advance human prosperity and security. We need more Muskoka initiatives on maternal and child health, more Ottawa treaties banning anti-personnel landmines, more Montreal declarations on the protection of LGBTQ+ rights. Ensemble, travaillons pour une aide canadienne qui continue de nous rendre fiers. Travaillons pour donner aux autres la chance que nous avons de vivre libre et en paix. Canada is a small country in terms of our population, but we are giants when it comes to our commitment to human rights, liberty, and dignity. Canada's historic commitment to our values and an active role in the world has helped forge my own foreign policy views. From the volunteer work my late mother and our family did on the Vietnamese Boat People Appeal when I was a child, to my time serving in uniform in the Canadian Armed Forces, to my work as a volunteer Rotarian before politics, fighting polio, Canada has long played a role in the world related to our values, our interests, and our compassion. To predict the future conduct of someone as your leader, you need only look to their past conduct. As Prime Minister, I will continue Canada's strong tradition as an active leader in development, security, and opportunity globally. To do that, I will need to renew partnerships with your organizations. We will need to set ambitious targets together and then track our progress. For me, it will be more about the follow-ups than about the photo ops. And I want you to know that I will have your back as we work together towards an active Canada on the world stage at a time that it's needed desperately. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Mr. O'Toole. Really wonderful to hear your perspective and how you're coming to the foreign policy issues that affect Canada and speaking to your frame of a principled international engagement for our country. We have limited time and we're going to cover a lot of issues with respect to our foreign policy. And so I don't want to take any more time up, and I want to pass the microphone, virtual microphone, to our partners in this event. And we're going to do so in sequence. And so I'm going to first ask Goldie Hyder, who's CEO of the Business Council of Canada, to take us from here. So over to you, Goldie.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick, to Cooperation Canada, and to all our fellow partners. Pleasure to be here with you. And thank you, Mr. O'Toole, for your remarks this morning. Very wide in scope. I'm going to narrow in on probably the most important foreign policy we'll ever have, and that is with our relationship with the United States. It's quite clear that the new U.S. administration has embraced several protectionist, what I would call America First type policies that would be harmful or could be harmful to Canada and Canadian interests. You mentioned that your government would have an interests-based or an interest-driven, I believe was the phrase you used, foreign policy. So to that end, what would you do to protect and advance Canada's interests on issues like Buy America, CUSMA implementation, supply chain integrity, and working together on both climate as well as energy security?
Well, thank you, Goldie. And I want you to say we're not even waiting for the next election. A few weeks ago, the Conservatives started the first Canada-US Economic Specialized Committee to look at Buy American, to look at this specific issue and to leverage the advocacy done by your organization, by businesses across the country who need to make sure that access to the US market is preserved. It is critical in securing our economic future post-COVID-19. And this will be something that will forge a very important part of our foreign policy. I didn't talk a lot about the US relationship, but clearly that is key. And my own background, having served in the Canadian Armed Forces, often trained and served alongside the United States. I worked in the private sector for a large American organization that has had subsidiary operations in Canada for over a century. We do well when we partner together, and we have to recognize the fact that in Washington, any discussion on trade is also followed immediately or concurrently with a conversation on security. So the Trudeau government now has been out of step with 3 US administrations with respect to China. We have to have alignment with respect to Huawei in our 5G infrastructure, with respect to transactions by Chinese state-owned enterprises. Some of the transactions that Mr. Trudeau actually reversed that had been refused by the Conservative government over security grounds came up when I was in Washington talking on NAFTA discussions and other things. The US has viewed us as not as reliable as Canada has been historically. And we have to leverage that very special relationship Canada has traditionally had of being both a domestic homeland security and trade partner. NORAD is the biggest expression of that, Goldie, but we've had free trade between Canada and the US since World War II. The US helped build our military base in Bagotville to preserve the aluminum supply for the war effort. By the 1960s, we had free trade that an automobile that my dad and the GM team in Oshawa produced in Oshawa could be sold as domestic in the United States due to the Auto Pact. Because we've always had aligned trade and security interests. We have to return to that. That means an alignment with respect to Chinese intellectual property theft, transshipment of steel and aluminum, and collaborating on energy security, on domestic homeland security, and holding to account bad actors on trade, I think is how we can reassert ourselves as the preferred partner to the United States. So that will be a key priority for me. I think I'm very well suited to the task. When I went down to see my bilateral partner when I was Minister of Veterans Affairs, Goldie, I had worked with the US Secretary of Veterans Affairs at the time, Bob McDonald, in the private sector. These links from a family through a business through to national security are key links that we have to leverage. And I don't think the US care about the photo op driven image approach of the Trudeau government. They want an interest-based approach, and that's what they will get with Conservatives.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll hear now, I'll cede the microphone to Perrin Beattie. He's the CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And so over to you, Perrin.
Nick, thank you very much, and welcome, Mr. O'Toole. I want to raise a question which is infrequently discussed at the political level, but which is of growing importance both from a commercial and a national security perspective, and that's the supply of rare earth minerals. As you know, these rare earth minerals are increasingly important in the supply of new technologies such as electric vehicles, but also in defense and other security technologies as well. Today, the supply of these materials is concentrated, particularly in the hands of the government in Beijing. This has implications for Canada, both in terms of our commercial prospects and for national security. What measures do you believe that Canada can take to ensure the continuing supply of rare earth minerals, which will be so critical for us in the future?
Well, thank you very much, Perrin. A great question. And I think the rare earth mineral piece and strategic resources piece, and you can include in that steel, aluminum, a number of commodities that the US, going back to President Obama, have tariffed Chinese steel for transshipment. These commodities we have to align on with our democratic allies, particularly our Five Eyes allies. And as I said, align on with respect to ensuring that we have domestic or allied supply of these critical items, and highlight the fact that bad actors should not corner some of these important global markets. I think it's also a time for us to really launch an ESGI revolution here in Canada. I've been talking about this for well over a year. Environmental social governance is key to large pension fund investments, other forms of corporate governance now. I include the I because Indigenous partnerships and participation can also be a part of this. I've spoken to Indigenous leaders about the opportunity to partner, including resource revenue sharing partnerships on the development of critical minerals, rare earth mineral development in Canada. With respect to energy production, softwood, we should really position our resource development as ESGI leaders globally. If the developed world cares about the principles behind ESG, they should procure their resources from a country that is a global leader on all those measures, not a global laggard, or quite frankly, a non-transparent, non-market economy where you can't even trust that there isn't internment labor in Xinjiang involved in the production of some goods. So this is something that I think the Five Eyes, the G7, the global world will be readjusting, whether it's carbon tariffs at borders, whether it's tariffing or banning the import of goods made in jurisdictions where there have been genocide or internment or security operations. This is something that Canada needs to lead discussion on so that not only we can benefit from it, we can structure global trade around it. And the rare earths piece, as we see more and more EVs on the road, we have to make sure that we guarantee these supplies domestically. We have the capacity to do that here in Canada, Perrin. And I often say, unlike the Trudeau government, I'm very proud of what we do in Canada, whether it's the resources in our ground or the resources in our head. And coming out of COVID-19, we need an all hands on deck approach to our economic recovery. And you will see us really positioning Canada as an ESGI global leader.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. We're going to hear next from Ruth Mogid. She's on the board of the Canadian International Council. She's also the Chief Equity Officer at the Inclusion Project, and she's joining us from the West Coast. So over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. And good morning once again, Mr. O'Toole. Thank you for taking the time to be here today, and super thankful for all of the partners that have put this together. As someone who came to Canada as an immigrant and just had heard so much about Canada's multiculturalism and how it's a beacon of hope and being touted as a force against the kind of polarization that is evident in some Western democracies, I just really wonder how this narrative of multiculturalism also tends to hide the many ways in which racism is baked into our laws and founding institutions. And just wondering if that really leads to some of the denials that we've seen in recent times around systemic racism in Canada. And just wondering too how Canada is modeling this cultural brand to the rest of the world with fault lines that have been revealed in our policies and practices with women, Indigenous, Black, and other equity-seeking groups being further left behind in the wake of the pandemic.
Thank you very much for the question, and an important question, because I've been listening to a lot of people gaining advice on the fact that there have been the highlighting of inequalities that have been starkly shown in the pandemic that, of course, were there before the pandemic, but these inequalities in many cases were exacerbated by the pandemic. We've seen the hard impact on a much higher ratio on Black Canadians, on marginalized groups, on Indigenous Canadians, the recession impact on women and female entrepreneurs. So how can we as a government develop public policy that not only addresses some of these issues in the short term, recovering from COVID, but can we use it as an opportunity to also make sure that we address it for the long term? And that's our commitment. And we've actually supported some of the government's work on this with respect to public safety and security, and looking at some of the unfairness within our prison system, within our justice system. I support some of the initiatives the Trudeau government is doing on Black entrepreneurs, and support for startups and scale-ups in that regard. In fact, a friend of mine and many business leaders have started the Black North Initiative to also be a partnership-driven approach. I'm very much a partnership person. I mentioned it in my speech. I don't think Ottawa has a monopoly on all the good ideas or good intention. I think often Ottawa could show leadership by being a funding partner to initiatives that are grassroots led, that are addressing real inequalities on the ground today. And I'm sure, Ruth, in your Inclusion Project work, you are highlighting these things. I know my friend Wes and many other people are looking at the entrepreneur piece. Wouldn't it be great if Ottawa could sometimes show leadership by showing there are leaders on the ground that need funding? And I've said this, my military experience teaches me, if you can't follow, you can't lead. And sometimes leadership is about knowing when to partner, when to follow, when to work together. And that will be my approach. So I do think, I've used the language, many people have been left behind with respect to COVID, both from a health and economic standpoint. How can we use the post-COVID recovery as a way to not just address it in the short term, but address it in the long term? And hopefully, as Prime Minister, I'll be able to partner with groups like yours, Ruth, to see how we can do better together.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. We're going to hear next from Colin Robertson, who's Vice President at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. So over to you, Colin.
Thank you. Mr. O'Toole, I recall one time briefing Cabinet, and on the wall was written, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." And thank you for spelling out your vision this morning, but I also compliment you on pushing forward on the follow-through side. As my old boss, Derek Byrne, used to say, getting it done. On the getting it done side, it does require investment. And so I ask you, will you reinvest in the Foreign Service? because over the past 20 years, it really hasn't had any investment. And to do the things you're talking about, you need the people in the field. Certainly Brian Mulroney and Jean Chrétien recognize that. You served in the military. Canada made a commitment with other NATO nations, Mr. Harper was the Prime Minister at the time, to 2%, to reach a target of 2% in terms of GDP for defense spending at Wales in 2014. We were to reach that by 2024, but we're about 1.1% today. So we've got a long way to go. So I'm interested in how you see that, because if you want to do these things, again, to get it done, you have to have the investment. My third question, you've talked about bringing back the Office of Religious Freedom. Democracy promotion was something also that Mr. Harper and Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Chrétien pushed. Would you see that as an area where Canada, yes, we have warts, but we also do it reasonably well in this country coming out of COVID, especially given, as you described, the challenge, the great challenge now between open and closed or authoritarian democracies? Will you invest in democracy promotion abroad?
Well, thank you. Good to see you virtually, Colin. I've enjoyed the events we've done over the years when I was Foreign Affairs Shadow Minister. And I miss seeing that vision quotation from the cabinet room, and hope I will get to see it again, and from a new chair this time. I agree. I'm very proud of our diplomatic corps and the professionalism they bring. Of course, during the Afghanistan conflict, we saw one of our diplomats perish. We saw the capacity building, both from a development and a diplomacy standpoint, and the military. So yes, we will make sure that there's a pursuit of excellence within our foreign service. I want to maintain and modernize and make more accountable our development funding. There will not be cuts. There will be a renewed focus on outcomes. You know, I talk about my military background, but my time with Procter & Gamble, there was a company that measured everything. We should be measuring the impact and developing that professional expertise that I think really does make us proud. And so there will be that commitment. I also, when I was Parliamentary Secretary for Trade, working on the European trade deal, the TPP, I went to Seoul, South Korea for our first FTA with a country in Asia. Of course, I also laid a wreath at the memorial to the 513 Canadians who died helping that country. The country that after the war was one of the largest global recipients of the World Food Program is now today one of the largest donors. If that doesn't show how an effective commitment to democracy, going to your question there, and to capacity building, trade, engagement, positive diplomatic relations, and a commitment to security can lead from poverty to prosperity. I liked the fact that we had a global markets action plan where we set priority countries, and I would like that prioritization to also lead to enhanced funding opportunities for countries of priority focus, where we can really enhance a margin of excellence in those countries. I also saw, particularly with the Korean Free Trade Agreement, how much the diaspora in Canada, business leaders, people that go back and forth, can also help. I would love to engage that capacity alongside our professional diplomatic corps to really help more Canadians feel a part of Canada's role in the world and to understand the impact we have. So as someone that before I came to politics my leadership has been developed through my experiences, and I try to refer to that at the end of my speech. I look forward to a real opportunity for Canada to lead both on a diplomatic development and as a strong military partner in our alliances again, and look forward to working with your organization and others to make that a reality.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. I'll take a bit of a turn now myself with Cooperation Canada, and it was great to hear your opening remarks and your statement of principle on a variety of elements with respect to Canada's global contributions to international development assistance, not least of which human rights, LGBTQ rights, women's health, Muskoka Initiative, and beyond. After really what has been decades of consistent human progress around the globe on extreme poverty, on access to health and education, on rights for women and girls, the community the global community unfortunately estimates that with the global pandemic, over the first 25 weeks of this, we lost 25 years of progress on the very same human progress indicators. Canada historically has both contributed to and benefited directly from global growth and progress in recent decades. You made the example of South Korea as being one that we can hold up. Our country, frankly, does well when the world does well. And the key challenges that we face as Canadians are also global issues. We can speak to climate change, inequality, global health, as clearly shown with the pandemic today. Yet, as you've also mentioned in your opening remarks, Canada's official development assistance is at historically low levels, lower than any time in a generation, lower than during the last Conservative government. Our country simply hasn't matched the resources to its global ambitions. And maybe here I'm connecting a bit to Colin's comments earlier. The Conservative Party has a long and important legacy in international cooperation. We see it, you mentioned some of the examples, Mulroney government's interventions against apartheid in South Africa, the Harper government's launch of the Maternal, Newborn and Child Health Initiative, the Muskoka Initiative, which had really huge impacts on women and children's health around the globe. So I'd like you to, if you would, speak a little bit to your priorities. What are your ambitions in the international development space? And will you reverse the trend of declining share of aid budgets? And in fact, in the last election, the Conservative Party proposed cutting ODA, and hoping that you can clarify whether that is your position, or whether you can put or commit to putting the resources to support the global priorities that you put forward.
Thanks, Nick. I tried to say in my remarks, let me be clear, I will not be cutting ODA, but I want to see measured performance outcomes and really making sure that Canadians can see our impact having an impact as it intends. So where I really see is measuring that performance and finding suitable partnerships. I also think we have to use our role in the world, which is friend and ally to many, including the United States, to help push for governance reform at the United Nations and some of its agencies. I don't think Canadians should ever have to worry about our commitments globally being deferred into less than intended sources, or to furthering conflict, or there to be a lack of accountability. So I talked about reforming peacekeeping. I think that same approach needs to be there whenever we're acting as a multilateral player. There needs to be accountability. And I think in terms of setting objectives, I really do think that development piece has to be, the child and maternal health had specific benchmarks, had specific partnerships that I think people could see Canada was having a positive impact in the world. I want to make sure that more Canadians understand that when we do use their tax dollars to advance an initiative in another part of the world, that is an expression of our values, but also our interests. And so I think the more we can have some sort of degree of positive work and economic diplomacy, where we can also leverage Canadian expertise, Canadian opportunity, as we provide opportunity globally, that will be a key issue. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. The pandemic has set the globe, has set Canada back. 30 years of progress for women in the workforce has been undone through the pandemic. 25 years of development progress has been undone. So I think rather than me saying right now, here are the goals we're going to target, coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, post-vaccines, when we can work as a team, we will identify together some key objectives in some key parts of the world where Canada will make direct progress, and we'll try and rally our allies to making progress as well. And I do think on the development piece, the more we retreat, the more that void is filled by Belt and Road initiatives or foreign development that is not as altruistic, compassionate, or based on human dignity as ours is. So there's a strategic security aspect to the development diplomacy that many people may not recognize, and I tried to address in my remarks. So I look forward to partnering with Cooperation Canada, with other leading NGOs, to set those objectives early. And then as Prime Minister, you will hold me to account for them, along with my commitment to ODA.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. And we'll hear now from the last of our 6 partners for this event. I'm going to turn over the microphone to Robert Greenhill. He's Executive Chairman at Global Canada. So over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Your comments on international assistance reminded me of one of your predecessors as leader of the official opposition during a minority government, John Diefenbaker. Because in 1950, he publicly supported the Colombo Plan while the Louis Saint Laurent government was still deeply divided, because he understood, as you do, the humanitarian and the geopolitical importance of Canada's engagement. And in fact, his public support played a big role in the cabinet finally moving to a positive decision and getting Canada's first real international development assistance program off the ground. So he, like you, saw that the importance of the official opposition and pushing the government to do the right thing. And then, of course, later as PM, in 1960, he created the External Aid Office, which is the precursor to CEDA, to help provide more coherence on international assistance. My question has to do with this challenge of coherence more broadly. As you've noted, it's a complex, changing, and challenging world, which really requires clear strategy, consistently applied, coordinated with all stakeholders, where the government must lead, of course, but all of us have a role to play because governments can't do it all in today's world. But many would argue that Canada today does not have a clear global strategy. More than that, unlike other countries, we have no global strategy document. And we don't actually have either a parliamentary or a governmental process to develop one. So we don't have a strategy today, and it's not clear that we'd have one tomorrow, which leads to the danger of foreign policy driven by inertia or ad hoc or nostalgia. So my question is twofold. One is, do you believe Canada needs a clear, more consistent global strategy? And if so, how would a Conservative government under your leadership develop one? And how would you engage Canadians and Canadian stakeholders in this process? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert. I don't get many comparisons to Diefenbaker, so I will certainly welcome that and hope I have the same outcome as Diefenbaker. You know, I think of Dief the Chief literally every morning when I run. I have a running route that loops by the Hong Kong Memorial, and I had the honor of meeting many of those vets. I always give them a salute when I run by, and outside the Diefenbaker building in stone is "Speak Up." And I don't think Canada has been speaking up. In fact, Mr. Trudeau not showing up for the genocide motion in Parliament was not in the great tradition that goes back to Diefenbaker, to Pearson and others. And so I will make sure that Canada speaks up and leverages our unique position. I think we're most uniquely positioned as the close friend and ally to the United States, as Churchill used to say, the linchpin then to Europe, as Canada can be a NATO partner, a Five Eyes partner, a G7 country that really needs to push strategically, as we did with Prime Minister Mulroney on apartheid, as we did with Prime Minister Harper with respect to Russia's inclusion in the G8 and their invasion of Crimea. I think we have a role where we can push our allies and friends in the right direction. And going on your global strategy piece, let's see how we can leverage all of those special relationships in a way that expresses our interests, both from a values-driven point of view. I said in my speech, I want us to be clearly articulating our commitment to human rights, dignity, pluralism, democracy in our foreign policy. I think we need to be more strategic in terms of our trade enhancement and opportunities. We used the Global Markets Action Plan when we were in government, but a strategic approach to really deliver. I'd like to see a rebound in our trade with India, for example, grow more trade in the Indo-Pacific with countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, great opportunities for our exporters, including our agricultural sectors, at a time that we will likely have prolonged disruption with respect to growth in China. The more we're diversifying, the more we can leverage that. And then on the development piece, as I've said, I want to make sure that we develop clear and attainable development goals, fund them, and drive partnerships. And so those commitments to human rights, to dignity, and to democracy will color everything we do, from a diplomacy, a development, a security, and military perspective. And it's really making sure that we're achieving those objectives. I don't just use the comparison of the photo ops and the follow throughs, but we've had 4 foreign affairs ministers in 6 years. We had a promised reset in the relationship with China that never came. The first foreign minister of the Trudeau era opposed Magnitsky sanctions and wanted to improve relations with Russia, Iran, some of the bad actors of the world. That has since changed, but there has been no distinct articulation of our national interest. And when there's been a time for Canada to really leverage those important relationships, my real concern, what's disappointed me is the Prime Minister, when Mr. Trudeau goes abroad, it seems to be more about him and his brand rather than Canada's interests and our values. That will very much change with me. And I think the world will welcome a really reinvigorated Canada that wants to rally the democratic allies on shared priorities in terms of development, security, and trade.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. There is no doubt that there are tremendous intersections between all of the files we've been talking about in trade, diplomacy, development, and other issues, security not least among them, when we talk about foreign policy. We've got a few moments now to talk, to elevate some questions that have come up from our participants, and so we'll turn to that. We don't have a lot of time, so we'll take those that we can, and we'll take those that are voted upon by participants. If you want to elevate questions, please do. And we'll start with the first, which is another intersection important in our foreign policy, and that's our addressing global climate change. And climate change is an issue that we're facing at home, and we have an important role to play in engaging internationally on promoting progress towards fighting global climate change. And so the question to you is, how do you see Canada's commitments to climate change fit into our foreign policy agenda?
Thank you. A great question, because often this is forgotten, the fact that climate change, the Paris Accord, is a global commitment. And if we allow just emissions to be transferred or to leakage to the United States or elsewhere, we're actually not advancing a global plan to lower emissions and combat climate change. A great example is Chinese aluminum, 7 times more carbon intense than the aluminum produced in Kitimat, BC, or the Saguenay region of Quebec. Mr. Trudeau and Ms. Freeland's trade negotiations with the United States and Mexico allowed transshipped Chinese aluminum into Mexico to displace Canadian, and increasingly to see more aluminum use in auto parts, actually eroding our competitive position in auto parts as well. Had we aligned back with the Obama administration on steel and aluminum transshipment and had an aligned approach with respect to China, I think we could have avoided that outcome. We need to integrate our approach on climate change as much with the United States as possible. I raised this with Mr. Trudeau in November in advance of the incoming Biden administration. I said, let's partner in many ways like Mr. Mulroney did with US administrations on acid rain, so that there's not just a leakage of jobs and investment from Ontario to Michigan, not actually meeting global objectives. We're just shifting emissions. We're also in the process, Nick, of creating a made in Canada approach to climate change, to reduction, and a net approach to emissions, where we're going to work with the provinces and others on reducing emissions with large emitters, where we're going to try and work on capture and sequestration. We have a bill before Parliament right now on carbon capture and sequestration technology, which holds tremendous promise. There's great opportunity with the hydrogen economy and other areas where Canada can meet our emission reductions and leverage our role as an ESGI leader. Remember, environmental, social governance, and Indigenous participation and partnerships. You're going to see a very serious, comprehensive approach to climate change from the Conservatives in advance of the next election. It's important for me as an MP, as a lawyer that worked on environmental issues, as a father, and as someone who considers himself an environmentally conscious conservative, because I want to make sure that Canada can lead here and also reap benefits from us having high standards when it comes to reducing carbon intensity, technology. I think there's great opportunity, but we really need to seize it.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. And there is no doubt that we have a lot of vested interest in the world resolving the global climate crisis. And we also know that those reaping the highest costs for global climate change are those in vulnerable countries. And with the upcoming COP conference in the fall, time to renew our commitments under the Paris Agreement. And so a significant moment coming on that front. So thank you for that. We'll take one more question, and just going by votes and what has elevated to the top. The Canadian government is presenting its foreign policy as a feminist foreign policy, and speaking to the importance of intersections of interests in our considerations of foreign policy. And so the question to you is, would you consider, or would you continue a commitment to a feminist foreign policy for Canada?
Well, this is a great example. Many of the policies, many of the initiatives, yes, that were very much driven, many of which started when I was in cabinet. Women in defense and security, for example, has been something that has been talked about for some time. So many of the policies, many of the interests, yes, but this is a great example, Nick, of the Trudeau government. As I said, great on the photo op, not there on the follow through. If you've been following the situation of the allegations surrounding two of our chiefs of defense staff, and the fact that Minister Sajjan and the Prime Minister knew about an allegation with respect to a woman who was serving her country and did nothing on it for 3 years. That was a failure of leadership. You look at the situation with Miss Jody Wilson-Raybould as Attorney General, pressured with respect to a deferred prosecution agreement for international operations related to a foreign player. So these all send signals. When you launch ambitious goals, but actually work totally contrary to them, that erodes people's faith in public institutions, in Parliament, and in our government. So I will hold myself to account and my team on policies in the interests of women, both at home and abroad, and make sure that our foreign policy is interest and values driven. An important value for Canadians is equality, is opportunity, is combating intolerance, racism, homophobia. That will be a commitment from me. It's been my commitment since I was in uniform myself, and it's the way I've conducted myself in my public life. And to restore some of the trust in our institutions, we need a prime minister that actually follows through, that isn't just about the announcement, but has those values being so important, he or she will hold themselves to them throughout their parliamentary career. So whether it's on the feminist foreign policy, whether it's on development aid, whether it's on Operation Honor in our Canadian Armed Forces, I will make sure that it's not just the announcement. We need to make sure, going back to Operation Honor, someone that wants to serve their country can do so with respect and free from harassment, and that there will be a zero tolerance, not that it will be covered up or hidden. So I think I will be a lot more accountable as Prime Minister, because that's how I've held myself throughout my professional career. And I think that's what Canadians need. Coming out of COVID, we need a serious, focused, strategic, and ethical government again.
Thank you for that. And I hear a commitment to the principles underlying a feminist foreign policy around gender equality and the intersections of a variety of issues that affect us globally. Now, we are a series of partners that convene this event. Really grateful to you for joining us. Ruth Mojid has offered to close us out, and so she'll summarize, and I'm happy to pass over to her, who will close out our call. Thank you very much, Ruth. Over to you.
Thanks again, Nick. And can I just say how much of a pleasure it's been for me to be sharing space and time with all of you today, and especially to Mr. O'Toole, who has taken the time to be here. Thank you so much. This morning, I heard you speak quite a bit on the power of partnership. the need to lead both from the side and also behind in terms of supporting. I heard you talk about accountability and the need for follow through amongst the many, many things that I heard. For all of our partners who are also sharing this space today, just want to say a very big thank you on behalf of the CIC Cooperation Canada. Thank you to the Business Council of Canada. Thank you to the Canada Chamber of Commerce, to Global Canada, and to everyone who's taken the time to join us here today. I have quite a bit to take back to my home, to the CIC, just around some of the learnings today, some of the interactions today, and all of the efforts that we're making to give Canadians a voice in global affairs. Thank you, thank you, thank you once again.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everyone. Be well.
Thank you so much.